Hello, my dear friends. You're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine and in the world on the 7th of April of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And this video we're not going to start with updates from Ukraine. We will talk about them in a few minutes, but today we will start this video with the Black Monday. What is the Black Monday? This is the situation when different markets of different countries show the poorest, the worst results ever since some period of time. First, let's talk about China, because when talking about the global markets, this is one of the first countries that faced the worst situation ever. Chinese worst day in the market since 2008. So this is how the local experts describe the situation when they face the consequences of the Black Monday. Let's discuss several statements made by the Russian Federation. They also face significant consequences, and today different markets fell. In Russia, some markets, some papers fell for 3%. Some of them fell a little bit more, but when compare Russia with other countries, they show good, more or less stable result. Probably the biggest problem for the Russians is that the price of Russian oil fell to $50 per barrel. That took place today, but later we got reports right almost before we start making this video that the Russian oil increased in their price for 67 or something like this per barrel. When talking about the Russian budget, they calculated their budget with the price of Russian oil around $70. So we see that the Russians were working today in minus. Now let's discuss the situation in Europe, where we can see the worst results ever, obviously, and the most important is that German defense contractor Rheinmetall stocks dropped 27%, probably the worst result ever since in comparison with other countries. And this is very interesting because this defense contractor Rheinmetall is a very powerful company, and they have a lot of contracts, they have a lot of job to do. And basically the entire Ukraine and combat actions along the line of combat contact are being supplied and supported by this company. They produce lots of weapons and lots of arms to Ukraine, and the numbers that they show us today obviously is unbelievable. Rheinmetall's worst trading day in the company's history. Frankfurt Stock Exchange is free fall, down by 9.15%. Germany is set to become the worst hit nation so far when talking about these numbers. The European Union shown us almost the same situation. Euro stocks 50 down by 6.15%. The same situation we can see in France, and when talking about the French market, Paris stock market down by 6.5%. And all these things, all these market downs, we could see before the opening of the US market. Obviously we see that before the opening of US market, the situation was already, let's say, maximum bad. When talking about the situation in the United States of America, we at the opening of this market we saw almost the same picture, but Donald Trump, before the opening of trades, made his own statement. The United States has a chance to do something that should have been done decades ago. Don't be weak, don't be stupid, don't be a panican, a new party based on weak and stupid people. Be strong, courageous and patient, and greatness will be the result. Trump minutes before US market opened, don't be weak, don't be stupid, don't be a panican. And right when the markets opened, we saw significant losses. Another 2 trillion has been lost in the US stock market since it opened. That the worst 3-day performance for the S&P 500 since October of 1987. But once again, while we were making this video, we got reports that the US market managed to handle with the situation, and not everything was so bad as was at the beginning of this trading process. So of course, let's wait and see what is going to be next. But now it's clear why this day has the title of the Black Monday, because this Black Monday can move further to the Black Tuesday, Black Wednesday, Thursday, and so on until the complete collapse of the entire economy. Now let's return back to Ukraine and let's discuss the situation there. We have lots of very interesting updates updates, and first let's talk about the northern direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours, probably the most important updates we got from the village of Gueva. The Russians managed to improve their position significantly since the beginning of their Gueva offensive operation that, according to different sources and geolocation, started somewhere around the 3rd and 4th of April of 2025. By the end of the 4th of April, the Russians managed to dig in deeper in the village of Gueva and basically to take under complete control the northern part. By the end of the 5th of April, the Russians managed to improve their positions further in the southern direction, and in this video we can see how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions with bombs. And this video, based on this video, we have adjusted this part of the settlement under complete Russian control. By the end of the 6th of April, the Russians improved their positions significantly. We have this video where we can see how the Russians were raising their flag on the roof of the church, or Orthodox church, in the northern part, in the central part of the settlement. And by the end of the 7th of April, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. As you can see, basically by the end of the 7th of April, the Russians control around the 70 or 80% of the settlement. The Russians control the entire northern part, the entire eastern part. The Ukrainians control just the central and the southern parts, but we believe due to this critical situation, most likely during the upcoming night between the 7th and 8th of April, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back towards the settlement of Garnal, and very likely tomorrow the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information, or at least the official Telegram channel of the Group of Forces North will do the same. As for the Belgorod direction, the situation here is very critical, and we continue receiving videos that confirms both the positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation and the positions of the armored force of Ukraine in both villages, Popovka and Demidovka. As we can see, according to these videos, there are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians used a significant number of drones to attack the Russians. The Russians are using artillery to force the Ukrainians to fall back. So there are very heavy clashes, and we believe that both villages, Popovka and Demidovka, would be reduced to ruins, and only then the Ukrainians would retreat, but obviously it will take time. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the northern Kupyansk direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation. There are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Kondrashovka. The Ukrainians understand that if they lose control over Kondrashovka, they're very likely that they will lose the control over the entire northeastern part of the Kharkiv region. So this is the map that was provided us by the pro-Ukrainian sources, Deep State, by the evening of the 7th of April 2025. In this update, we can see that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. But the worst thing that's, let's say, worth attention is the gray zone and contested area that was added by pro-Ukrainian sources. In this article and this update, we can see that the gray zone and the contested area is sometimes the same as the territory that is in the complete Russian control, which means that the pro-Ukrainian sources have lots of doubts regarding the situation around the village of Zaporizhzhia, the village of Kondrashovka. Once again, based on this post, we can make a conclusion that the Russians are advancing, that Ukrainians are not able to stabilize the situation, and most likely during the next several days all these contested areas and the gray zones would be colored in the Russian favor, and then this might be the beginning of the complete disaster for the armored force of Ukraine in this direction. Because if the Russians are able to take under control the village of Kondrashovka, this will allow the Russians to cut one of the most important supply arteries that goes from the city of Kupyansk further in the northwestern direction towards the settlement of Veliki Burluk, and further from the settlement of Veliki Burluk, this supply arteria goes to Bily Kolodezi and then to the city of Volchansk. So the Russians are about to cut and to destroy the logistic in the northeastern part of Kharkiv that could lead to complete chaos and panic from the Ukrainian side. Now let's move further and let's discuss the updates probably from the most important direction. We are talking about the central and the southern Kupyansk direction, or the Barova and the Leman directions, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. According to information we have, according to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, today the group of forces, as a result of actions of the group of forces west, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Katerynivka. We're talking about this village, and according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, this village was taken by the Russians today, completely secured, and the Ukrainians were forced to fall back. Let's compare the map. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 6th of April of 2025, and according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 7th of April. This is a very huge disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine, because the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the main supply line, the road of 526, and basically maybe even to cut this road physically. The logistic in this area was destroyed by the Russians as well. Now this territory, this area was cut into many pieces, separate logistic pieces that the Russians will handle with every single one separately. So the Russians are advancing, and as you can see, we have a lot of icons from this area. Of course, the Ukrainians were trying to counterattack the Russian units. Of course, the Ukrainians were trying to do all their best to slow down the Russians and to force them to fall back. But we see that the Ukrainians have huge problems with the servicemen and with the manpower. They basically don't have enough of forces for this, or the Ukrainians are trying to accumulate all these forces somewhere else with the purpose to begin another full-scale offensive operation, maybe somewhere once again along the border with the Russian Federation, or maybe the Ukrainians are planning to counterattack in the vicinity of the city of Chasiv Yar. As for now, it's very difficult to understand, but while the Ukrainians are thinking where to attack, where to use all the resources, if they have them, the Russians continue advancing. Furthermore, there are very heavy clashes in the northern flank of this offensive operation, in the vicinity of the settlement of Nadia, which is still under complete and strong control of the 3rd Azov Brigade. Today the Russians published this video how they were attacking the temporary deployment point of the armored forces of Ukraine between Nadiivka and Sergeyevka with TOS flamethrower systems. So we believe that this is something like artillery preparation before another attempt to attack from the Russian side. We expect that there are going to be very heavy clashes for this forest, and if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this forest, then most likely the Russians will be able to outflank the Ukrainians in Nadia, and in the end of all, to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this territory. If Ukrainians lose the village of Nadia, the Russians will be able to synchronize their northern and the southern flanks and to attack the settlement of Chernyshina from both directions at the same time with the same tempo. So this is very important. Once again, as for this stage of Russian Barova Leman offensive operation, their primary task to cut the salient, to maintain the lines, to shorten the lines, to release additional forces, and then to use them either in the Barova direction or in the Leman direction. Maybe the Russians would use both forces, these forces at the same direction at the same time, because from this perspective it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold their lines. Furthermore, according to information we have, the commander of the 1st Assault Battalion of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade of the Ukraine Armed Forces reports that in the Barova direction the Russian command is now headed by Mordvichev, who previously headed the Russian command in the Avdiivka Pokrovsk direction. So the Ukrainians are saying that very experienced general that was responsible, who managed to get victory in the battle for Avdiivka, Selidova, all these villages and settlements in 2024 and in the late 2023, was redeployed to the southern Kupyansk direction, and now he's in charge for this area, which obviously means that the Russians are very serious for this direction. They adopted they put in charge very powerful and very experienced general who most likely will show results in the very near future. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to answer the village of Tarskoye. This time this information was provided us by pro-Russian resources, but right before we started making this video we got another report from more or less reliable resource, pro-Russian resource, that as a result of clashes the Russians today managed to establish complete control over the village of Tarskoye. So as for now we don't have proofs, but let's wait for additional updates, but maybe tomorrow before the next update we will adjust and we will color this territory, everything along the village of Tarskoye in the Russian favor, which is going to be the beginning probably of the battle for the city of Leman itself. Ukrainians without the village of Tarskoye will have no chances to hold the village of Zaporizhzhia, because from this time the Russians will attack the village from the north, from the east and from the southeast, and this will force the Ukrainians to fall back towards the settlement of Leman. So we see that the lines are collapsing in this area and it's very difficult to understand what the Ukrainians are planning to do with this. Furthermore, the Russians intensify their artillery activities in the vicinity of the city of Siversk. If you take a look at this map, you're gonna see the significant number of artillery strikes that took place between the city of Siversk, the village of Verkhnykamensk, Serebryanka and Grigorovka. As for now, we don't see any movements or any attempts from the Russian side to attack the city of Siversk. This area is well fortified, but as for now, we can see that the Russians are trying to reduce every single square kilometer of this area till ruins. Most likely, the Russians, since the beginning of the special military operation, suffered the biggest losses in this area. Not just about Siversk, it's the city of Bakhmut, Siversk, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk. The Ukrainians managed to prepare well fortification area here, and the Russians have problems to break this area. But we see that despite all losses, despite the problems, the Russians are moving and the Russians are getting closer and closer to the city of Siversk itself. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation between the cities of Konstantinovka, Chasiv Yar and the city of Toretsk. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions in the central part of the city of Toretsk. According to different mappers, the Russians began advancing in the central part with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area or to catch the Ukrainians in cauldron. Now we see that according to different mappers, the Russians are advancing from the northwest with the purpose to get as close as possible to the southeastern position. So basically the Russians are trying to establish complete control over these territories, which will allow the Russians to tighten the noose around the Ukrainian positions and the Ukrainian forces that are currently located on the territory of the central part, which means that in the very near future, and telling the truth, we expect that this upcoming night or maybe the next night the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back in this area, otherwise they would be caught in cauldron by the Russians and they will suffer huge losses. Furthermore, the Ukrainians continue bringing more and more forces to the line of combat contact, but as you can see, according to all these geolocations, the Russians established complete FPV drone control, complete artillery control over this territory, and when the Russians discover anything they destroy it immediately. So Ukrainians as for now have very huge problems with the concentration of their forces on this direction. Now let's discuss the situation in the vicinity of the city of Toretsk. Today the Russians carry out another offensive operation along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. And according to geolocations that were provided both by the Russians and by the Ukrainians, we see that the Russians managed to cross the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal and probably to land infantry. In this video we can see how the Russians were landing their infantry on the Ukrainian side of canal somewhere along this tree line, and the Russians were trying to take these trenches under complete control, and then the Ukrainians began bombing and attacking the Russian positions in this area with cluster rounds. As for now, we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to improve their positions and to move further in the western direction towards the village of Delivka. It's unknown, we don't know this, but one thing we know for sure, that Ukrainians were forced to fall back from several positions along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. We see that the Russians continue improving their positions, and most likely in the very near future this area is going to be very active. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the vicinity of the city of Pokrovsk, where the Russians managed to improve their positions and basically where the Russians managed to stabilize the situation. The Russians, according to different sources, secured completely the village of Lysovka. We're talking about this territory. This information was confirmed both by pro-Ukrainian sources and by neutral sources. Furthermore, we start receiving lots of updates from the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine further in the northern direction, which means that the Russians may try to attack and to improve their positions on their way to the city of Pokrovsk and the city of Mirnograd in the very near future. As for now, the Russians are tasked to take under control several trenches and the fortifications between the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration and the edge positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. We believe that these trenches and this dense network of the fortifications is the primary task of the armed forces of the Russian Federation for the very near future. This position can allow the Russians to control both cities and to establish complete control over the logistic between two settlements. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions along the railways, and currently the Ukrainians are in defense state. All Ukrainian attempts to counterattack the Russian positions in this area that took place in January, February and March were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians suffered huge losses and were forced to fall back. Now the Ukrainians are in defense state, trying to regroup themselves and to prepare defense positions before possible Russian major offensive. But we believe that as for now the Russians, even if they try to attack in the direction of the city of Pokrovsk, but just with one purpose, to improve their positions, as we just discussed in the vicinity of Lysovka, we believe that the Russians are planning to advance in the western direction towards the to finish the battle of Udachna and Molodetska, towards the villages of Novoalexandriivka, Novosergeyevka, Novomykolaivka and Muravka, and towards the settlement of Kotlerovka. So the Russians will improve their positions and they will try to cross the region, the border between Dnipro and Donetsk region on this line. This is very important question for the Russians. There are lots of positions, and from this perspective the Russians will be able to cut logistic and to reduce Ukrainian capabilities in the city of Pokrovsk itself. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians also continue their offensive operation. The most important updates are coming from the village of Rozliv. According to pro-Ukrainian sources, today, by the end of the 7th of April, the Russians managed to secure the village of Rozliv completely. They still show us the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine around the settlement, but as for now, we believe that it doesn't matter. So we believe that in the very near future, the Russians will secure this territory completely, and we're gonna start receiving first updates and the growing of the contested area and the gray zone towards the village of Bogatyr. As for now, the Russians are attacking the Ukrainian positions in this area. As you can see, according to this video, there are still lots of buildings that were almost undamaged as a result of clashes, which means that the battle for this territory is just beginning. As for the South Donetsk direction, according to information we have, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to enter the village of Shevchenka from the east and to take under control the lithium deposit at the eastern outskirts. So this is very important. The Ukrainians lost another lithium deposit, another probably way how to influence the US and how to get additional supply and support from them. The clashes has begun on the outskirts of this village. We believe that during the next 24 hours, the Russians will try to improve their positions and to take this settlement under complete control. If the Russians are able to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area, the entire line of Ukrainian defense collapses automatically. We are talking about the villages of Novosilka, Vilna Polya, and the village of Shevchenka itself. And by this offensive operation, the Russians will be able to establish complete control over this territory, which will allow the Russians to shorten the distance, to maintain their positions, and to accumulate additional forces to move further in the direction of Velika Mikhailovka. Now let's discuss the situation in the Zaporizhzhia direction. Today we got another video how the Russians from the Babry or Beaver FPV drone squad were attacking the Ukrainian positions and vehicles. This is the fourth day in a row when we receive another video where we can see tens of Ukrainian vehicles that were damaged and destroyed by the Russian attacks. The Ukrainians suffer losses, and we see that currently they can't stabilize the situation, and the most important, they can't concentrate a critical mass in this area with the purpose purpose either to repel Russian attacks or to counterattack. Furthermore, when talking about the pro-Russian resources, today we got a very important statement from those who are on the ground in this area. Kamenska awaits our means Russian assault. From the south, we have been squeezing it for a long time. From the west, they dripped up Kakhovka reservoir, and from the east, having taken the settlement of Lapkova. Our troops came close to Kamenska, which ended up in a semicircle. And then the Stepnogorsk, there is Stepnogorsk stuffed with Ukrainian forces, and even further, the regional center, the city of Zaporizhzhia. So once again, several weeks ago, we got reports that the Russians concentrated up to 70,000 soldiers in this area, and the distance between the edge positions of the armed force of the Russian Federation and the city of Zaporizhzhia is less than 30 kilometers, and which is obviously not very big distance for the Russians when talking about this area. So something is big is going to happen here. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.